Hello and welcome to the 68th edition of the GreenWave podcast by Synergy International. I'm SYNi, your host, and today's pod is titled Europe's Storage Gap, Batteries, Gas Shocks, and the Price of Waiting. Europe has spent years adding wind and solar at serious pace, yet the flexible layer underneath them has lagged badly. That gap is now colliding with another oil and gas price shock, and the result is familiar, irritating, and expensive. We get cheap power in the middle of the day, expensive power in the evening, and governments suddenly rediscovering that electricity markets still have a gas problem. Batteries sit right in the middle of that pressure point. They are becoming the practical hedge against a system that still hands too much pricing power to imported fuel. That is the live issue. The deeper system problem is even plainer. Europe has become far better at generating clean electricity than at holding it, shifting it, and valuing it properly. We have built more variable supply. We have not built enough flexibility, enough storage, enough network reinforcement, or enough market structure that rewards fast response where it is actually needed. Then a geopolitical shock lands, gas moves, and the whole thing starts rattling again. The machine keeps telling us the same truth, and Europe keeps acting surprised. The market evidence is now too thick to ignore. EU battery deployment is rising fast, because it has to. Solar Power Europe says the EU added 27 gigawatt hours of battery storage in 2025 alone. A record year, taking the bloc's installed battery fleet to 77 gigawatt hours. And that 77 gigawatt hours is one moment of stored energy. The fleet can charge and discharge repeatedly. If that 77 gigawatt hour battery fleet cycled once per day, it would shift about 28.1 terawatt hours of electricity over a year before losses. On the same EU average assumptions, that is enough for about 3.4 million homes with direct electric heating, or about 10.2 million homes using heat pumps. That sounds large until you put it next to the system need. The same market review says Europe needs around 750 gigawatt hours by 2030 to match the flexibility demands of a far more renewable power system. So yes, growth is strong. The gap is still enormous. Europe is running hard and still behind. Meanwhile, the price signal has become louder. The EU's Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, known as ACER, says renewables supplied half of EU electricity generation in 2025, which is a serious achievement. But daily wholesale price swings were around 5 times higher than in 2020. Why? Because more solar pushes down daytime prices, and then the system still leans on gas when the sun drops, and demand is hanging around the dinner table. We discussed this topic at length in last week's pod. ACER is unusually direct on this point. Gas-fired plants are increasingly used for evening flexibility, and that pushes wholesale prices upward. There it is. The evening price in a supposedly transformed system still carries the smell of gas, and the recent shock sharpened the point. Energy think tank. Ember's work on the latest crisis found the cost of gas-fired power in Europe jumped by more than 50% in the first stretch after the February escalation, with clear knock-on effects for electricity costs. In other words, the old dependency still sits inside the new system. Europe has decarbonised a meaningful share of generation. It has not escaped fuel price risk. That difference matters to households, to industry, to treasuries, and very much to anyone trying to finance power infrastructure without losing sleep. The political memory problem here is grimly simple. Europe did learn from the Russia shock, but it learned in halves. It relearned that domestic renewables matter. It should have known that LNG dependence comes with a receipt attached. What it did not learn fast enough was that renewables without a strong flexibility build-out still leave the system exposed at exactly the wrong hours. Too many policymakers treated storage as the next chapter rather than part of the same sentence. Grids, batteries, connections, market redesign all later. Later is an expensive hobby. There is also a tendency to talk about batteries as if the main story were chemistry, or cars, or a nice future technology curve somewhere over the horizon. That misses the commercial point. In the power market, batteries are turning into timing infrastructure. They absorb surplus solar when power is cheap or even negatively priced, then release it into the evening ramp when prices rise and gas would otherwise set the tone. That is a revenue model, a hedge, a grid service, and a political stabilizer rolled into one asset class. The battery is increasingly a market instrument. The cost story has moved in the same direction. The International Energy Agency says average battery prices fell another 8% in 2025, and battery energy storage systems saw the sharpest declines, with average global prices down to roughly 1/3 of 2020 levels. Our World in Data tracks the longer arc and shows lithium-ion battery cell prices down more than 99% since the early 1990s. That kind of cost compression changes behavior. It changes investor appetite, dispatch economics, off-take strategy, and very quickly, it changes what counts as sensible system planning. When the price curve moves like that, anyone still talking about batteries as a boutique add-on is reading from a very old slide deck. Still, let us keep our feet on the floor. Batteries are becoming cheaper, more useful, and more central. None of that means they solve everything. Short-duration batteries deal brilliantly with intraday shifting, balancing, frequency response, and fast ramps. They do not solve a week of low wind in January on their own. They do not replace transmission build-out, nor remove the need for dispatchable low-carbon capacity. They especially do not magically cure a permitting system that treats urgency like a rumour. Europe still needs a portfolio, and that portfolio still includes networks, interconnection, flexible demand, hydro where available, and some form of firm, clean capacity. The point is narrower and stronger than battery evangelists sometimes admit. Batteries are becoming the fastest and most commercially useful way to cut the gas premium out of many hours that still matter too much. We always pay attention when people start pitching demand-side flexibility as the cheaper substitute. Demand-side response absolutely deserves a serious role. For industrial loads, EV charging fleets, some data center management strategies, cold storage, and electrolyzers in the right configuration, shifting demand can be very cost-effective. Pexapark makes the case well. Demand-side flexibility already competes with batteries in parts of the ancillary services and capacity stack, especially in short-duration balancing products. But demand-side flexibility comes with a hard limit. It is conditional. It depends on industrial processes, customer behavior, control systems, tariff exposure, and whether the load can move when the system wants it to move. A battery has a much simpler personality. When it is charged and technically available, it dispatches. Pexapark also points out that broader evidence for demand-side flexibility moving wholesale price spreads at scale is still weak, partly because most households in the EU remain on fixed-price retail contracts and have little reason to respond to hourly signals. Their conclusion is the right one for this moment. Flexible demand expands the flexibility ecosystem. Batteries are still likely to compress intraday spreads first, because they are scaling faster, and they exist for that exact purpose. That is why this episode is really about Europe's storage gap, not Europe's storage future. The future part is obvious. The gap is where the money leaks out today. You can see it in negative price hours, curtailment and solar capture rates. Evening power prices still move like they have a gas boiler hidden in the basement. The battery story is not mainly about how much renewable electricity Europe can generate. It is about how much value Europe keeps from the renewable electricity it already generates. Take Germany first, which remains one of Europe's major battery markets and one of the clearest examples of why storage is now a system requirement. It has built solar at serious pace, it deals with regular periods of oversupply, and it has some of the most obvious midday price cannibalization in the market. Germany, along with Spain and the Netherlands, has been clocking very high volumes of zero or negative pricing hours. That is great news for anyone who enjoys cheap electrons, and terrible news for anyone trying to finance generation on a merchant basis without a flexibility strategy. Germany has done one thing right institutionally. It is one of only 4 EU countries that the Joint Research Centre says had a dedicated national energy storage strategy in place as of April 2025. That is good. The market still needs faster execution on grids, connections, and commercial structures that let storage earn its keep. Italy is the harsher case, as it remains much more exposed to gas in price formation, and recent Ember analysis captured that brutally. In Spain, gas influenced the electricity price in only about 15% of hours in 2026 so far. In Italy, it was 89%. That is the difference between a system that has started to structurally loosen the gas link and a system that still lives with it hour after hour. Italy, therefore, has some of the strongest commercial logic for storage in Europe. Batteries in Italy are not simply about smoothing solar output. They are about directly attacking the hours where imported gas still writes the price tag. If you are a developer, utility, or policymaker, and you cannot see the opportunity there, you may need something stronger than an espresso. Spain gives us a different lesson. Spain has made real progress in loosening the gas grip on power pricing because its wind and solar build-out has been so strong. That deserves credit. But Spain also shows what happens when renewables run ahead of storage and grid absorption. You get very cheap solar, weak capture rates, more curtailment pressure, and a growing need for batteries to stop the market from eating its own success. Cheap midday power is wonderful for consumers who can use it. It is less wonderful for a project finance model built on revenue assumptions that have wandered off to find better weather. Then there is Great Britain, which sits outside the EU but squarely inside the same strategic story. The UK government's Clean Power 2030 plan says Britain may need 23 to 27 gigawatts of battery capacity by 2030, compared with 4.5 gigawatts installed in 2024. That is a very large ramp in a very short period, and it tells you something important. Even one of Europe's most active storage markets still sees a massive capacity gap ahead. Britain's value, as an example, is simple. It has moved earlier and faster on battery market formation than many EU countries, and even there, the required scale-up is huge. Europe should read that less as a compliment and more as a warning. Ireland deserves a quick mention too, because the European Commission's Joint Research Committee singles out its 2024 Electricity Storage Policy Framework as exemplary. So, it's another one of the 4 EU countries that has a dedicated storage strategy in place, along with Germany, Spain, and the Netherlands. Across the bloc, 15 had fully transposed the legal definition of energy storage into national law, 9 had only partial alignment, and 3 still lacked a definition altogether. That is not a serious way to build critical infrastructure at speed. Europe keeps saying storage is essential, then legal and regulatory treatment arrives in a patchwork that looks like it was assembled in a moving vehicle. That regulatory lag lands directly on commercial deployment. If storage is still double-charged, poorly classified, slow to permit, or boxed out of parts of the balancing and capacity stack, investors do not get a clean signal. If connection queues remain clogged with speculative projects, serious projects wait. If national frameworks remain vague, banks demand higher returns or stronger contracted revenue. the market can live with risk. It hates fog. For developers, the main implication is clear. Storage is moving from optional upside to core project architecture. Co-location with solar or wind can protect capture rates, strengthen revenue diversity, reduce curtailment exposure, and, in some markets, improve the bankability story. Standalone batteries can monetize arbitrage, balancing, reserve products, and capacity where the framework exists. But the easy money narrative is already looking a bit tired. Revenue stacks are more sophisticated. Augmentation, degradation, duration, cycling assumptions, inverter limits, grid fees, and market saturation all matter. A battery deck that still waves vaguely at multiple revenue streams without a serious market view should be escorted out of the room. For lenders and investors, this means two things at once. First, storage is becoming harder to dismiss as merchant fluff because the system need is now obvious and the policy direction is getting firmer. Second, underwriting discipline must sharpen. The wrong battery in the wrong node with the wrong duration and the wrong assumptions on ancillary revenue can still become a very expensive box of disappointment. The right battery in the right market, placed where congestion, solar spill, and evening scarcity intersect, starts to look like essential infrastructure. Location and market design do a lot of the talking. For utilities and system operators, batteries carry a different value again. They lower balancing costs, reduce reliance on gas peakers for short duration ramps, and help absorb variable renewable output that would otherwise be spilled or exported at poor value. The Joint Research Centre's wider European inventory already counts around 70 gigawatts of operational storage power, and another 97 gigawatts expected across Europe, including non-EU neighbours, such as the UK. That shows interest, pipeline, and intent. It does not change the deeper message. System planners are still catching up with the speed of the flexibility requirement. For governments, the agenda is painfully unglamorous. Clean up legal definitions, fix network tariff design, speed permitting, sort connection queues, give storage full market access, run flexibility needs assessments seriously. Where markets still do not produce investable signals, design auctions or support frameworks that do. Europe has already reformed electricity market rules to recognise the need for fossil-free flexibility. Now the member states need to stop treating implementation like an optional summer project. And then there is the geopolitical layer, which deserves more airtime than it usually gets. A battery sitting inside your power system carries a security premium in a world of shipping disruptions, fuel hoarding, and stressed commodity routes. Stored electricity on your grid does not need to come through Hormuz tomorrow evening. That is the good news. The awkward news is upstream. The International Energy Agency says China accounts for around 80% of lithium-ion battery supply chain production capacity, and battery pack prices in China were 35% lower than in Europe in 2025. Europe's security hedge still depends heavily on a supply chain it does not control well enough. Local resilience at the grid edge still rests on industrial dependence further up the chain. There is no point pretending otherwise. That is where a broader argument about an energy security premium starts to resonate. The world is moving into a rougher phase, more asset-heavy, more anxious about physical systems, less relaxed about trade routes and availability. In that kind of world, batteries gain value from three directions at once. They make renewable power more bankable, grids more stable, and energy systems less exposed to fuel shocks in the hours when gas has historically been king. That also makes them strategically expensive to neglect. Bottom line is, Europe's storage gap is a commercial vulnerability. It shows up in retail bills, industrial competitiveness, fiscal pressure, curtailment losses, and the politics of every fresh fuel price spike. Europe has already proven it can build large volumes of renewable generation. The next test is harder and more useful. Can it build the boring, valuable, deeply consequential layer that turns cheap, clean generation into stable, affordable power across the whole day? We say yes, because that is the real contest now. The argument is over who captures the value, who avoids the volatility, who stays exposed to imported gas, and who actually builds the flexibility spine of the new system. Batteries are not the whole answer. They are rapidly becoming the fastest serious answer in the hours that keep tripping Europe up. And that, to be honest, is why this is such an important moment. Europe's next energy security chapter will be written by what sits on the grid at 7 p.m. on an expensive day. If that answer is still mostly gas, Europe has learned slowly. If more of that answer becomes stored renewable power, backed by better grids and better market design, then the system starts to look genuinely more resilient, more investable, and less politically hostage to the next crisis. The battery story, in the end, is a story about time. Europe has run out of excuses a little faster than it has built storage. Well, that's a wrap on our 68th GreenWave podcast episode. Thank you for spending part of your day with us. Hopefully, you consider it time well spent. You can find the GreenWave podcast on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, iHeart, Podchaser, Boomplay, and Player FM. Please follow the show, share it with your network, and leave us a review if you like what we are building. You can also follow Synergy International on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, and Instagram, and visit us at synergy-international.net for more on our work across sustainable development, energy, and strategic advisory. Until next time, keep riding the green wave of sustainability.